IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me Ganesh Chakravarthi, who's the editor at Takshashila, and that's one of many hats that he wears. But we've had this interesting conversation over time about, the kind of world that we're living in, and we sort of usually talk about policy issues which are more immediate and things that governments can do and things like that. But we thought today we'd sort of take a step back and we'd look at essentially how history is being recorded not by the media or by historians, but actually by authors and writers and creative thinkers and people every day, right? I mean, all of us are writing and sharing our experiences more than ever on social media, although I wouldn't classify that as literature. But interestingly, it's a record of times of what we are experiencing, and what we are experiencing are, of course, extraordinary times. So we thought we'd go back and look at how people like us, you and me, have captured extraordinary times in diaries or in memoirs. And that's the kind of conversation that we're going to be talking about today. Ganesh, welcome to this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to sort of begin as to why I thought this was an interesting conversation to have. I mean, I was reading over the last few months, I've been reading Fang Fang's diary. She's obviously the Chinese author who wrote the diary about the lockdown in Wuhan. And I was reading through her diary and I started sort of getting a sense of, it's fascinating how this became an international phenomenon, even a political phenomenon in China, and came in for all sorts of criticism and everything at one end, but also lots of appreciation at another end, as though this was providing catharsis to a city which was going through an unprecedented situation. So Ganesh, I firstly wanted to sort of get your take on diaries as a literary tool. I mean, are they valuable literary tools in a sort of classic sense, or is this a much more sort of modern phenomenon, or is it that the context matters to some of these things?
So it's a combination of both. So when I say that it's a combination, the diaries usually acquire lasting value over time. For instance, if you consider some of the most popular diaries and memoirs like Anne Frank and all of these people, Nelson Mandela, and all of these individuals, the kind of importance and the kind of value that it gains over time as more and more people attach newer experiences to the articulations that these people came out with, that is when it starts acquiring more and more value. And as to the question of whether it has literary value, I think it has immense literary value, because the purpose and point of literature is always to create worlds, to create perspectives that did not exist. And memoirs are able to do that in a much better sense, in a very visceral first-person point of view. And what it also adds is that there is this temporality aspect of literature, as in when you're creating worlds, when you're creating newer ideas, when you're creating some sort of characters, plot lines, and all of those things, you have this liberty of creating everything anew. And that allows you a lot of freedom, whereas memoirs always work within the limitations of what exists. And the daily human struggle and the daily experiences that people undergo always fall within the realm of reality itself. And memoirs are one of the shortest way that you can find to step into another person's shoes and then look at it from his or her point of view.
That's the interesting thing, right? I mean, in so many ways, this is people who are writing these diaries, the most popular ones, like you mentioned, things like Anne Frank's diary, a lot of it captures a very personal experience. So, Anne Frank's diary captures her sense of sort of loneliness, a sense of isolation, the struggle with the residents in the annex, that's the difficult relationship that is there. The fact that she gets these bits of information by listening to radio, by actually what others are listening to on the radio, and all that sort of weaves into what she's writing about what she's experiencing. And when I was going through Fang Fang's diary, that's the other thing that I also got a sense of, that, so many of the things that she wrote, and she was writing this in January and February. And since then, different cities around the world have experienced different degrees of lockdowns. There were so many things that I could relate to. The fact that at one point of time she was talking about something like, exercising at home. And she's talking about how a friend of hers would, be running in her home, and she would run X number of kilometers within the house. And Fang Fang would talk about how this is so ludicrous, that it is so difficult to do this, because how would you do it in your house? How would you have the patience of just going back and forth within that small space to exercise? Yeah. So something or she would talk about, say, taking the pet down for a walk or things like that. And we've seen that in our cities right now where we're living, right? Where lockdowns have been extended and you are permitted to only, like in my complex, we were only permitted during the lockdown to go down if you have to take your pet down for a walk. So some of these things, it's very personal, yet there is a sort of universal appeal to some of these things. And that sort of, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. That sort of feels like what makes diaries relevant to a larger audience, because you have to connect to universal.
Absolutely. So that's the key difference between what memoir is and what an autobiography is, right? Autobiography is this an entire person's life, his career success, or his professional success, or something that he has achieved. And in a way, it paints this picture of how an individual had mapped out everything properly. Well, there's a wonderful quote by Raghuram Rajan himself, where he says that, I don't remember the exact words, but it is something along the lines of, autobiographies are written as if the author had everything mapped out, the risks, the uncertainties, and he or she was fully immune to all of the things that potentially went wrong and was able to deal with it. Whereas memoirs and diaries, on the other hand, have this sense of, so they don't really come with a sense of victory. They don't really come with a sense of completion. They don't come with a sense of linear structure of any sort. You don't really have to tie up the loose ends of your story when you're writing a diary. You don't really have to have some sort of a profound idea. You don't have to have some sort of grand ending to your sort of journey that you're experiencing. And for most individuals, this is normal life. And a reflection of that, the fact that such things exist in common across the world, is what appeals when it comes to diaries more than anything else.
All right. So let's look at some of the interesting things that you sort of come across over time. You were telling me that there were certain quotes that you wanted to sort of go through and talk about, which sort of highlight the kind of things that you've read when it comes to this genre. Can you sort of go ahead with what you want to read out?
Yeah, so I have 3 or 4 quotes that I have found. These are based on the memoirs and portions of the memoirs that I have read. One is this wonderful memoir by Paul Kalanidhi, When Breath Becomes Air. So this is a very popular best-selling memoir right now. This is an individual who was at the peak of his career in the medical field. He was a doctor. And when he was in his mid-30s, he was suddenly diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And it was such a sudden shock to his particular set of circumstances. And indeed, he even passed away from that disease. And his memoir was published posthumously. There's one lovely quote that he mentions, which is somewhere in the middle. He says that science may provide the most useful way to organize empirical reproducible data, but its power to do so is predicated on its inability to grasp the most central aspects of human life, which is hope, fear, love, hate, beauty, envy, weakness, striving, suffering, and virtue. Right? The amount of richness that is captured in it, I think that quotes like these are able to capture the entire human spirit itself, because it covers the wide range of spectrum of all the things that humans can feel and exude. Whereas on the other hand, you also have something which is the foundation of life itself, that is science. So when you are faced with a situation like this, when you are faced with insurmountable odds, when you are faced with the exact antithesis of what you studied your entire life, how exactly would you perceive that? There are instances where we also go through certain situations which might seem insurmountable. And there are instances where we also feel that if things could have been done differently, maybe it would have turned out differently as well. But the fact is, reality cannot be changed, and how you choose to pick yourself up, how you choose to go ahead despite all the odds that are coming at you, is basically what this particular quote and this particular book also gives out. And that, I think, is quite fantastic. There's another one that I would like to share. This is by, I'm not sure, actually, this is a very popular best selling book as well. This is by Ishmael Bia, which says A Long Way Gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier. So this is about an individual who, in Sierra Leone, so he and a couple of his friends sneak out of their houses to go to a different city to perform some sort of music concert and some reality contest of some sort. But what happens is, on the city where they are going to is attacked by the RUF. And over there, they get displaced. They try to come back home. His parents are missing when he comes back home. So he goes into this long search across Sierra Leone and becomes part of the RUF forces itself, becomes part of the rebels. And then it's just incredible the kind of experience that he underwent. And of course, he was eventually selected as the UN speaker as well after several years of misery. And he was eventually adopted by another person in the United States. So here is a very good singular quote that outlines basically the state of mind that you would go through when you have lost everything that you potentially loved, when you have lost everything and every semblance of reality that has been constructed ever since your birth. And the quote goes, every time people come at us with the intention of killing, I close my eyes and await death. Even though I am still alive, I feel like each time I accept death, a part of me dies. Very soon, I will completely die, and all that will be left is my empty body walking with you. It will be quieter than I am. So this is basically him expressing his anguish at having lost his parents and having lost his brother and all of that. So it's a pretty powerful way of expressing stuff. And these are perspectives that you will never get when you read things like news analyses, when you read things like research papers, when you take into account historical analysis, political analysis, and all of that. Because in the end, the best way that an individual can learn the lessons of what went wrong and potentially the mistakes that someone else committed, the mistakes that humanity committed as a whole, is through the emotional reactions and the understanding of why people behaved the way they did. And I think diaries are the best way that can help you do that.
That's fascinating, right? I mean, the amount of depth that you can capture in some of this. I wanted to sort of look at another angle of this. Given that often these are written as sort of first-person accounts, and sometimes you also have cases where authors write as a character, and it's the sort of the fiction is written in the form of a diary. I mean, one of the things that sort of comes to mind is the very sort of famous Chinese author Lu Xun's diary of a madman. It's one of those things that sort of comes to mind because he speaks about the sort of chaos in post-Qing China in the early 1900s, and he talks about that in the sense of how everything around him seems to be crumbling, and therefore he writes in the context of the diary of a madman. But would you sort of see some of these? I mean, we've established that yes, we would look at it as a literary truth, but would you see them as even a historical record in some ways, or is history, or does history need to be far more academic, far more objective, or can works like these also be part of sort of objective history?
It's interesting you asked that because there's another wonderful quote that I would like to say over here. It's by Carol Tavris, who in the book she says, Why We Justify Beliefs and Decisions. It says, history is written by victors, but it is the victims who always write the memoirs, right? So there is a wonderful correlation between how these things are taken. History is academic in nature, obviously, because that is exactly how, that's an entire discipline in itself. And the discipline demands a certain kind of rigor, a certain kind of how do I say, detachment from how things were, because otherwise you will never be able to disseminate facts from perspectives. And that is one of the key things that you have to always do when regarding any of the disciplines. But that's the thing about it, right? They can be historical records. Definitely they can be. In fact, my introduction to these concepts of memoir started with Mark Sullivan's Beneath the Scarlet Sky. So, Beneath the Scarlet Sky is this wonderful piece of slightly fictionalized biography of an individual who lived in Italy and covertly helped hundreds of people, hundreds of Jews escape the clutches of the Nazis. And that is something incredible because he was living in Italy. Italy was part of the Axis, and they were actually at the forefront of the battlefield itself. But in spite of all of this, this was a man who served in the Italian army, but was able to help many of the Jews escape persecution, maybe even death. And this is basically how it started. And his account signifies that not everybody in a particular faction will be in favor of it. And these are perspectives that you will never explore if you only consider the historical analysis of it. So if you consider the historical analysis of the World War, the parties are very, very clear. And the theaters are set, the characters are set, and you have a firm understanding of who is doing what is good, what is bad, and things that went right, things that went wrong. But the deeper understanding of why things were the way they were comes from first person narratives. And it is things like these that expose us that it's not always black and white, even if even if the world considers someone as the enemy, something as bad, something as good or bad. So that's why I think, yes, diaries and memoirs should also be considered as historical records.
It's fascinating that you say that, right? Because most historians would be sort of worried about the subjectivities of such documents.
Yeah.
Yet it is the subjective nature of something like this which adds color and more sort of depth and layers to how we record history conventionally, right?
Absolutely.
So let's look at sort of this final strand of thought that I had in my mind when we sort of got to this conversation, which was about the sort of present environment that we're living in. Like you said, right? There is a context within which this literature sort of exists, and that context is critical. In present day context, I wanted to get your sense on whether documentation of life like this for individuals, and a lot of us are like doing this already on things like Twitter, Facebook. One would not conventionally see what you post on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or wherever else as literature. But this is a recording of what you're doing on a daily basis. And to many, just having that space of expression and perhaps getting not trolled, but being treated well is a sense of catharsis.
Right.
You connect with somebody. And there's one level where you're expressing that, and that gives you a sense of therapy or catharsis. And whether you do it on your personal space, on a blog anonymously, or whether you do it publicly, although the public problem is that you may end up getting treated quite badly, given that social media isn't very kind to people. But do you think that there is merit in looking at recording, even if you're not even if you're not a renowned author, or if you're not somebody who has a flair for literature, just recording your thoughts on a daily basis, particularly at a time when we are facing an unprecedented situation around the world and it's not going to ease anytime soon. Is that sort of, and this is going to have a sort of impact on mental health going forward. So just the fact that you can do something like that on a daily basis, half an hour with yourself, would that be beneficial to people? Is that something that people should sort of look at? The barrier to doing something like this is that, but I won't do it well enough. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to therefore read and realize that a lot of the beauty of some of this is how you weave what's your daily experience and even what may seem absolutely mundane. So I want to get your thoughts on that. Diaries is sort of a sense of therapy in many ways, particularly in extraordinary times.
Absolutely, yeah, I think so. I definitely concur with that, because writing a diary is the easiest process of going in the path of self-discovery and transformation, because you get to examine yourself with a slightly mature perspective, right? And that's basically what it can do. And yeah, the biggest concern over there is that people will always think that, maybe I'm not doing it good enough. But that's basically the essence of a diary. And in a way, the diaries and people recording very mundane everyday events is a reminder for us all that there are many complications that exist in this world, and these are some of the ways in which we can make sense of what is going on, because there is so much abstraction right now out there when it comes to news, when it comes to events. For instance, take the pandemic COVID times. Very few people actually understand the life cycle of viruses, virology, and it's just beyond the grasp of so many individuals, even I would say to a large extent, even myself. But the fact that I'm able to see the events that are happening around it and try to make sense of it and record it, putting in my own perspective, will help me make sense of a world from my perspective, my point of view. And in a way, that itself adds value, because in the end, we should all remember that we're just trying to get by as best as we can. And the sooner you understand different perspectives, even though flawed it might be, I think the whole world, the collective knowledge of the world in itself will be enriched by these things. And yes, it is, of course, very therapeutic to put down your thoughts and make some sort of sense out of it always.
So, folks, if you're listening in, like Ganesh keeps telling a lot of the students that we have in our programs that I want to see you writing, take some time for yourselves and write. You never know how you might end up producing something that's wonderful for the outside world, or if nothing else, even if not from that instrumental perspective, you might just end up helping yourselves through what are really, really strange and difficult times. Ganesh, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And folks, thanks for listening. Do stay tuned to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. Before I tell you about some of the shows that we have for you this week, I really wanted to kind of really point out the incredible efforts of our host and our team. We've been able to maintain most of our production schedule in this lockdown, which is going into 4 months now. And I couldn't be happier with the fact that our hosts and team have been able to kind of just get all of this stuff out so incredibly well. So I just really, really wanted to kind of call them out for that and thank them for their support in this time. And since I spent so much time talking about that, and I want to get you out of here quickly, let me give you a quick update on a few shows that you should check out this week. On Sliders, we had Amish Tripathi, really interesting discussion, both of them dive deep into history. Monty Panesar was on Edges and Sledges, another really cool show. On Advertising is Dead, Done My Butt showed up. That was a cool episode. Malini Agarwal, also probably better known as Miss Malini, showed up on Absolutely Right. It's just been an absolutely gangbusters week in terms of like the kind of guests we've had and the conversations we've had on the network. Please do check some stuff out. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
Namaskar, this is Ashish Vidyarthi. Yes, my friend, these are challenging times, but in these challenging times, we can create something extraordinary. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey, available on the IVM Podcast, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, we have a great opportunity called life. Cheers.